In this video, we're going to be integrating promises into the requests.js file. We're going to convert getPuzzle and getCountry from using the callback pattern to using the promises pattern. Now there's one more small tweak I want to make to our example over in promises.js. This is going to be the last piece to the puzzle for figuring out how we're going to get that done. In the above example, if we wanted a way to customize our HTTP request or whatever we do inside of here, we know we could do that by passing in another argument. That's exactly what we did over here in requests.js. We passed in the word count as the first argument and the callback as the second, and we used the word count down below inside of the URL. We did the same thing for getCountry. I passed in the country code as my option, and then the callback function. I was able to use the country code down below to correctly find the item in the array. Now this is great, but currently we don't have a setup for that with our promise. So we're going to go ahead and tweak this code down below before we integrate anything into requests.js. What we're going to do is take everything we have right here, from the new operator to the closing parenthesis of the constructor function, and we're going to cut it out. We're still going to use all of that stuff, but we're going to use it in a slightly different way. I'm going to move the myPromise variable down below. Don't worry, we'll give it a value in just a moment. And up above, we're going to create a function similar to getDataCallback. So const getDataPromise using the promise pattern. This is also going to equal a function. And all we're going to do is return what we previously had before. I'm going to return the new promise. Now I'm able to get my promise by calling getDataPromise. getDataPromise. And now our code is going to work as expected. Hopefully you see the subtle difference between the two. Previously, we could not have called this with a bunch of different options. Now we have a way to actually get that done. I could call getDataPromise with some random data like 1, 2, 3. I could access that data here, and I could use it down below when I'm actually making my request. The reason that I'm pointing this out here right now is because we're going to have to do the exact same thing with getPuzzle and getCountry. Yes, we are going to remove the callback argument, but if we want an option, we still have to pass that in via a function argument, and we now have a way to get that done. There is one way we can improve the syntax here even further. What do we have? We have an arrow function that just returns something, so we can take that something, and we can put that right after the arrow and use the shorthand syntax. So we just pasted this highlighted stuff in. I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to remove the curly braces with the return keyword inside. If I wanted to return a number, I would put it right here. If I want to return a promise, I'll define it right here. And there we go. This is the shorthand syntax for a function that returns a promise. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because we're going to see this quite a bit as we work with other people's code or try to read the source code for third-party libraries we're using. We're going to have to get used to looking at arrow functions like this, where we define a function that returns something. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and prove that it actually works. I am going to comment out my 2 reject calls. I am going to uncomment my 1 resolve call. And then somewhere inside of here, I am going to include the data that was passed in. So right here, a template string. This is my success data, :space. And then I will just inject the data exactly as it was passed in. Now I would expect that to print down below twice, once for each then call. I'm going to save promises.js, switch over to the terminal, and from here we can run node promises.js. And what do we get? We get a blank screen for 2 seconds, and then we get our information. And now that we've seen this with our fictitious example, let's go ahead and do it with something real. We're going to work on converting getPuzzle over to a promise API as opposed to a callback API. And this process really is not going to be too bad. I'm going to start by taking all of the code that's currently inside of getPuzzle and just cutting it out. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. We'll paste it back in and modify a little bit of it in just a few seconds. Now, getPuzzle is no longer going to take an argument callback. Instead, the getPuzzle function is going to just take word count, and it will return a promise. Now, we can return the new promise right here, but as we just saw, we can also use the shorthand syntax. So let's go ahead and get a little more experience with that. Right after the arrow, we're going to return a new promise. And we know that the constructor function for promise takes an argument. It's a function. And this function gets called with 2 arguments. Both are functions themselves. We have resolve and we have reject. Now, what are we trying to put inside of here? Well, we're going to do the exact same thing we did before with the callback pattern, though this time we are working with the promise. So I'm going to paste that code in. Then we really just need to make a few small tweaks. We need to change the 2 lines where we use callback, which is no longer defined. Right here, we have a callback for our success data. Instead of passing in the second argument, we are going to pass data.puzzle to resolve. I'm going to resolve data.puzzle. Excellent. Now we have our other callback where we pass in the first argument for an error. Instead of doing that, I'm just going to call reject. I'm going to call reject with the exact same error. An error has taken place. Now we can remove our callback call, and that is it. Nothing else needs to happen in order to use this as a promise. We are now getting a promise back as the return value. So let's go ahead and save requests.js and actually use it in app.js. So currently, yes, we are calling getPuzzle, and we are still passing in the word count. That is indeed still the first argument, totally valid. The second argument, though, no longer exists, so let's go ahead and delete it completely. We're just going to leave things like this. For consistency's sake, I'm actually going to switch that over to single quotes. Not sure why I used double quotes before. Now, what comes back from calling getPuzzle? We know that a promise comes back. Now, like we did in promises.js, I could store the return value in a variable and then call then on that variable later. Also, I could choose to call then right here, which is the exact same thing, just without creating that variable. So I'm going to call then, and I'm going to pass in my 2 functions. The first one for when things go well and the promise is resolved. The second one for when things don't go well and the promise is rejected. So right here, we have our first function. Then I'll add the second function. The first function is going to get access to the puzzle. And all we're going to do for the moment is print it, console.log puzzle. The second function is going to have access to the error, and we're going to print the same message we had before. Console.log, a template string. I will start off with error, colon space, then right here, I'm going to interpolate whatever the error message is. So with this in place, we have the exact same functionality we had before, but instead of working with callbacks, we are now working with promises. Let's go ahead and save app.js and make sure things still work over inside of the browser. Make sure both files are saved. If I head over to Firefox, I can crack open the developer tools. If we click that one right here, what do we get? We are still indeed getting our puzzle. This time, Christmas account. If I give things a refresh, I get freckled face. If I give it a refresh one more time, I get rare find. So the new pattern is working just as the old did, only this time around, we are using promises. Now it's your turn to do the exact same thing for get country. Right here, there are 2 steps for this challenge. Step 1, convert get country to return a new promise instead, replacing the callback argument with calls to resolve and reject in the function code. Then for step 2, you want to call get country and use the promise that gets returned along with the then method on that promise to print the country if things go well or an error if things go poorly. Now, before I set you free, remember we can always simulate an error by just messing with things over here. For this example up above, I can go ahead and just add that extra T. For the example down below, you should be able to go ahead and just add a whole bunch of extra characters onto the end to generate something like a 404. If I save things and refresh, right here, error, an error has taken place shows up. If I have a valid URL and no errors get thrown, I do get my puzzle, in this case, holiday baking. So take some time to knock this one out, pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and move through the process together, starting by modifying the requests.js file. Inside of here, I'm going to kick things off by taking all of the code that currently makes up the function and cutting it out, copying it to the clipboard. Then, instead of returning what we had before, we are going to go ahead and return a new promise. So right here, new promise, passing in our function and naming our 2 arguments, the first one being resolve, the second one being reject. Then we're going to go ahead and paste all of our code right inside. From here, the only thing we have to do is change the calls to callback. This argument is no longer going to exist. So we can remove it from up above, and down below, we can go ahead and replace the first one with a call to resolve. I am going to resolve the country instead of passing it in as the second argument to callback. And down below for the error, I am going to use reject. Now in this case, I do still have it as the first argument, so I can actually just change the name callback over to the name reject. Looks like I also have a second space in here, so I'll go ahead and remove that as well. Perfect. Now that getCountry returns a promise, we can save this file and take advantage of that promise over in app.js. Currently, we're getting no output because we are expecting the second argument to be called. The second argument over here isn't even named, let alone called, so we have to switch up our code. Right here, let's go ahead and remove everything we have so far and add then on. Inside of then, we're going to pass in our two functions. The first one is when we get access to the good data, that would be the country. The second one is when we get access to the error. And for the error, we can do exactly what we did up above, console.log, a template string, error, followed by the actual error message. Now, what are we going to do when we get the country? We're going to go ahead and print the country name like we've been doing for our work with getCountry before. Right here, console.log, that would be country.name. Perfect. With this in place, we can remove the challenge comments and actually test our work out. I'm going to save app.js. Over here, I'm still getting Mexico, and I am still getting windy conditions showing up. Now we've converted both of our functions over to the Promises API. And that's where I'd like to stop for this one. In the next video, we're going to continue talking about promises. Now that we've seen some basic examples, we're going to explore some more features that they bring to the table. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned and I'll see you then.